Hey, Anne Claire.
Hi,
How are
Meg.
you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
So good. So ready to chat. Love our recording days. Great way for me to start my morning.
Yeah, and we missed it last week.
I know. I missed you. It was weird having an open Wednesday morning.
It's like, I have so much time on my hands.
I know. I had a really productive Wednesday morning. Not going to lie.
Yeah, that's what happens. Because we do have this nice little chunk of time where we chat about our Recovery Collective stuff, and then we do the recordings and whatnot. So I can imagine that sort of, I gifted you time, basically.
Yeah. Except for you're the one who was really living during that time because you were on your way to Florida.
Yes, I was. Oh, it was so nice. It was like a jump from winter to middle of summer. And there's that feeling of being warmed up by the sun.
Yes.
And it's not at all the same as being warmed up by a shower, a bath, central heating, or a fire. It's just, that's the first thing that I really felt and that took me in that mood when we got into Miami. And then I was like, ooh, I feel the sunshine on my skin and like it's really warming me up. I love that feeling. I really love that feeling.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, that's such an interesting perspective I haven't thought too much about is how we can be heated up in different ways. Our bodies can heat up in different ways. And it's a totally different sensation and type of warmth, which being heated up by the sun is so different than wrapping yourself up in a blanket. Both are amazing experiences, but very different.
Yeah, it's just fundamentally different. And you know what? Actually, it's a very random comment, but I was reminded of that by an oracle card. So like a few weeks back, I was like pulling cards and there's a little booklet with like text in it. And I was reading the text and there was like a little nudge of like experience being in the sun and feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin. And obviously it was winter in Belgium at the time. It still is winter. I don't know, technically it's spring now, but it's not like it was when I was in Miami. But like a few days later, it was still like nicer weather with some sunshine. And so when I was outside on my little mental health walk, at some point I stood in the sun and I was like, because I was reminded of the card that I had read. And I don't know, I think my brain reconnected to that idea then. And I think that's why I carried it with me when I got to Miami. And I was like, ooh, yes, that feels so good. Because obviously it's also different if you have just your face because you're bundled up because it's cold and you just have the rays of the sun on your face. You're wearing a nice little sundress.
Oh my God, that's so funny. I actually do that now that you talk about it. I'll go on my little mental health walks and then there are like little openings of sunshine on the path where I'll just stand there and face the sun and soak it all in. And it just feels so nice. But it is very different than being on a beach and letting your whole body soak up sun. Wow. Okay. What was your favorite part about Miami?
The palm trees, the sunshine, the heat, the food, Cuban food. Yeah. I mean, we weren't in Miami for long because then we headed out to the Florida Keys for the wedding that we were attending. And there, my favorite parts would be the boat and the beach because that's not exactly what I experience on an everyday basis over here. And I'm quite a bit more of a mountain person and like a path, like inland human.
You're a path person? Wow. Shocking.
I just realized what I just said. Yes, I am. I'm a path person. But I still love, obviously, like the ocean and the sea and the sand and nature in that way. But I don't gift to myself that experience as much as I seek the inland experience through like my little hikes and whatnot. So anyways, that was lovely. And obviously the humans and the wedding was just so amazing and stunning. And yeah, it was really lovely and a nice way to recharge my batteries in many different ways.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I loved seeing your little reels of you just living life on a boat. It's like there's
yeah. And that road trip, because like from Miami, you can drive all the way to Key West. And I had done it once in the past, but my partner hadn't. So we drove all the way down and we rented a convertible, and that's just so much fun because I don't know, it's just like the whole experience is just so fun.
Wow, that's giving me ideas. I'm actually going to Disney World not this weekend, but next weekend. And I'm doing Fort Lauderdale to see my grandma first, and then 3-hour trip to Orlando. I wonder if that's probably not a fun drive, but
I don't know. I don't know this drive particularly, but that was really a lot of fun. If you ever do that drive that I did, highly recommend renting a convertible because it's not the same spirit and the drive is stunning. So
I feel like you and Steven know how to live. Like you guys live it up when you're on vacation. My thought, like you guys go for the good food. You go for the little, like the convertible thing. That sounds awesome. Like, I don't know.
We try to be intentional with, is there a way that we can experience more pleasure in the moment? It's not something that is realistic and reasonable budget-wise on an everyday basis, but we can all, I think, sometimes just afford to spend a little bit more time thinking about how could I increase the pleasure satisfaction factor from a moment or an experience, and then allow ourselves to experience that. Sometimes it's not just about literal budget of money. Sometimes it's just allowing ourselves to think about it and then happen. Because it can be about like taking things slower sometimes. When you mention like we live it up in terms of food, it's not like you're going to have to eat at some point anyway, but we like to be a bit extra intentional to make sure we have extra time and that we can like choose what we really feel like having and explore things because we find that's fun. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent, but yes, we like to live life.
We'll actually be talking about travel and recovery very soon. So
True.
This is very relevant. True. We'll be talking about, I guess since summer's coming up, it's all on our minds, our shared mind, you and my mind.
Well, part of my brain is shared with a part of your brain. And we're like a Venn diagram.
In the diagram, it's like my mind, your mind, RRC, Valet de Moses, and brushing our teeth. No,
exactly. And listening to Lovely Day as we brush our teeth.
Yep, that's it. We'll keep adding to that Venn diagram, but that's what it is right now.
It's a good start. I like it.
Me too. Me too.
However,
talk about recovery stuff today.
We don't have to, but we do have a really important, interesting, and very much shared experience question kind of thing to talk about. So shall jump into it, I think.
Let's do it.
So one of the lovely humans watching us over here on YouTube, so hey you, has shared with us that they feel that they're being triggered a lot lately, and they're wondering if we have any tips to deal with those triggers.
Really great question. I find that in our space, triggers can happen pretty easily because mental health is a delicate subject and comments can be misinterpreted. They can be taken personally. They can just crack someone open in terms of the stuff they're working through, right? The triggers are everywhere. So I think my first tip when it comes to managing triggers is to, first of all, start to notice when you feel activated, right? Start to notice when something happens that heightens you and makes you feel like angry or pissed off or like scared or whatever it might be. And notice how that feels in your body. And if there are any patterns like, oh, when these things come up or these things are said, or I look at this profile on Instagram, it's like that sort of thing is you always start with observing and noticing those emotional responses. That's what I would start with.
I love that you started with that because I do want to say, typically we don't deal with triggers in the moment, the first time they show up. Like it's more of you always, most of the time you start with a post-mortem. You look back and you're like, okay, I observe, like activated something in me. I observed that I acted in a way that I now feel meh about it or very much disagree with. And that's where I can now go back and collect data and information about, okay, so what did I experience? What did that bring up for me? And why did it do that? And how do I wish I could be responding instead of reacting, because typically the issue that we bump into is that the triggers will happen and it's like trigger reaction, right? And if we are, for example, in an eating disorder recovery context, that's going to typically mean trigger using a behavior. And that's super unhelpful. It's not getting us closer to recovery. And we want to be able to go from there to how can we make sure that either trigger doesn't happen or that when it happens, we can spot it and we can pause, do the stuff, and then respond instead of react.
Yes. I love how you bring up two angles. It's like there are a few ways you can approach the whole concept of triggers. First, you can work to make changes so triggers aren't happening. Create a trigger-free environment as best as you can. Very common. That could look like in the Recovery Collective, we have guidelines on what's safe to talk about, what's safe to say. So changing the environment, or maybe that's unfollowing certain accounts or people that trigger you. So that's the proactive approach, like trigger prevention. And then there's also the approach of observe, collect information, and then build awareness so that when you feel that happen again, you can pause and respond and take care of yourself. So there's that response instead of that reaction happening.
I'd like to rephrase this exact same thing as external boundaries, internal boundaries, the deal. Because when we look at making sure that we're not putting ourselves in situation or consuming, for example, content that is triggering, that is literally us setting an external boundary. When we set the rules for Recovery Collective Call, what we're doing is setting very clear boundaries, right? Expectations of everyone engaging in the conversation about what is okay and not okay. We're setting boundaries that are external because they involve the world around us. So if I decide to not spend time with someone, if I decide to unfollow or mute someone online, if I decide that a certain physical place is very triggering for me and I decide not to show up in that physical place, I'm setting a very much external boundary because I'm making that trigger not happen. But then conversely, like what you said was we also need to make sure that our internal boundaries are set, i.e. the ones between me, my healthy self, my soul self, part of me that takes responsibility for the life that I'm living, and my, in the past, eating disorder that is suggesting something wildly different. And I need to make sure that I'm also responsible for placing those boundaries internally inside of me because I know that I will not live in a bubble and I will have to, because I'm choosing to, right? To live in the world, I will have to deal with things that are activated within me. I still do, not in eating disorder terms, but in other terms. I'm responsible for how I'm letting that sort of pull and push me in different directions. And so I'm placing my own internal boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so helpful to think about is there is a responsibility within yourself to set those boundaries and also take responsibility for, once you're aware of it, how you can respond and making sure it doesn't turn into a spiral where you're pointing fingers and blaming other people for your reaction.
Yeah. And this is a tricky topic because
it is a tricky topic. Yeah.
Realistically speaking, this can mean wildly different things. Again, it can be this person has a really hard time understanding how they're being harmful, and it's just really unfair and shitty of them to disregard the fact that you have to have them in your orbit because let's say a close family member and you don't really have, for whatever reason, a choice or the ability to not physically be with them and be around their words that they speak. And that's really unfair that you are then responsible to set those internal boundaries and to be faced with those triggers. That's really crap. There's no way for me to say that differently. It's not fair. In the same way that systems can be very oppressive and very invalidating and gaslighty. And that's also unfair. And at the same time, it's unfair to you to postpone your healing until the system has changed. It doesn't mean that the system shouldn't change. It means that you still have a job in that moment and a responsibility towards yourself and your own healing to say, yes, that is unfair. And I will still make sure that I'm working on lowering how impacted I am by this thing. And then 100%, it's normal for you to wish that it could be different and to expect from other people to help you to change the system. Or, and this is another case that is even more nuanced and tricky, is that we are all singular, different humans. Something that's triggering me is going to be different than something that's triggering you. And so who am I to expect from everyone in the world to adapt to me when I could be triggered by something that is completely neutral or even nice for someone else? So I can also be triggered by something that is so personal that it's still my job to deal with it internally, because it's me leaving my life, and I can't wish, expect from the world around me to adapt to my specific situation. And that's tricky, but that's reality, and I'm trying to be empathetic and nice and compassionate here, but we also can't lose all agency and responsibility in those situations.
You did such a great job elaborating that delicate balance, right? There is this acknowledgement of, there are legitimately valid triggering systems out there, people out there that we can validate as like real and difficult to handle and manage and unfair. And then on the other side of that, there is a level of responsibility of being able to work on healing that trigger without expecting everyone and the systems to change first. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is like,
exactly. And again, like we're talking very generally speaking. So of course there are so many nuances and cases and scenarios here. But what I'm really trying to say is there is like an entire like spectrum of situations where we get to be triggered. And what I'm trying to say is, yes, sure, place the external boundaries. Yes, it's okay to find that some of them are completely unfair. Some of them are just life. Like it could be both. It could be that you are just simply responsible. That's it. And I'm not saying that as a harsh, mean person, but simply because we're all different and we're going to be activated by different things. In other cases, it can be just straight up unfair, straight up not cool that you have to be responsible for that. Like I work with clients who are in families and they don't have the choice to not live with those family members who are horribly triggering all the time and do not seem to be able to integrate the fact that certain body comments or food comments are just really unhelpful. And yet I know that I have to quote unquote play with the rules of this game, which is we're stuck in this situation. So now we need to work around the situation, taking into account the situation, even though, of course, I truly 100% wish I could shift the system in which my client is healing. Yet that is not an option that I'm being given in this moment. And so where I can have the most impact and where our work with the client can be the most impactful as the treatment team is to help the client figure out how to set those internal boundaries so that when the triggers do happen, they are still equipped and empowered to not let that hurt their recovery and their life moving forward.
Yeah, I love that connection to recovery. I think that's a really good example of being stuck in an environment you can't change. So what can you do? What boundaries can you set for yourself so that environment is a little bit more livable? While you can't tell your parents to stop commenting on your body, or maybe they're not listening, or stop talking about food. It's like, how are you going to take care of yourself when those comments are made? I really love that. And I think you're right when like you were also talking about that. Gosh, there's so much I want to add here, but I was thinking about how people in our space are still posting before and after photos of their either their weight loss journey or their eating disorder restoration journey. And that's where I feel like we're in this environment where we should collectively know what is triggering by now, but there are still people who either don't know and they're not educated on the subject to know that before and after photos are triggering, and to protect their community, they could refrain from posting those. Or they actually don't care that it might be triggering and they're willing to take the risk of potentially triggering people and posting those photos anyway. And I think it just goes to show, again, environment is so difficult to change. Like, I think at this point, it would be very obvious to people in the space that this is not something that's acceptable to do. However, there are people in the space who are still doing it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Unfollow this. The statements. I'm not trying to sound too harsh here. Everyone can choose whatever they want. But I agree, there are certain things that are well-known triggers, like numbers, specific behaviors, things that typically lead to people feeling not sick enough, invalidated, increased comparison on all levels, not helpful. And it's not like they're too hard to know which one they are. I mean, come on. Also, we are specifically trained to know what that means and to be extremely responsible when it comes to our communication, whether that is on a public level or on a one-on-one with clients level. I remember Caroline drilling it down because yes, that is so very important. And I do not understand how people can still be unaware or choose to ignore that. The very cynical part of me simply thinks that they know that those sorts of posts, for example, on social media gain a lot of traction and that to an extent, they are reaching for the part of the brains of potential future clients that is going to typically feel reassured by what they're seeing in the pictures. Because let's be real, when we talk about before and after pictures, we're talking about someone who is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not wrong, from extremely emaciated body, which is not close to the majority of people's experience of an eating disorder, into a very socially acceptable body size that is white, cis, female, very thin, toned kind of body. Extremely unhelpful. So unhelpful. And so my very cynical me thinks, well, yeah, they're just trying to get clients because they're still selling diet culture when they post things like that. Because they're like, well, if you work with me, this is the result that you're getting. But I don't want to speak for everyone and sound like I'm not kind at all, but yeah, that's what
How you really feel, Anne Claire. No, but it is true. So I think for folks watching, it's just important to recognize if you find yourself triggered by those common situations in our space, like before and after photos, or someone writing about their behaviors, or someone writing about numbers and using specific numbers. It's like those will happen, like inevitably. If you are following certain influencers in this space, you might run into something very triggering. And so it's, again, reflecting on, is this triggering for me? How do I typically react? What are my triggered thoughts? And how can I start to add a little space in that moment and pause and take care of myself instead of do something or say something very reactive or use behavior?
Now, I want to say something. Even very well-intentioned people will trigger you. And this is something that I was alluding to earlier. And that is that we're all triggered by different things depending on who we are, where we are at in life, in recovery, etc. And also because even as professionals, we know so much, we forever learn, and we will make mistakes as well. And I'm saying this because there is fault that is human, and it doesn't mean that it's okay. It just means that some people can still learn and evolve. Thank God we all do as humans. And also to an extent, there's simply individual differences. So I know, because I also have this conversation with clients where we will have conversations about this thing that someone said really triggered me. But what they said is actually a neutral statement. For example, a statement such as, oh no, I'm good. I won't have this because I'm full. That's a neutral statement. They're stating their boundary of eating something more because they're like, no, I'm full. I'm good. Thank you. There's no judgment. There's no opinion. It can be neutral. And yet here I am talking to a client who took that as a morally charged opinion on their choice to still have something, or on the fact that they have to have something else because let's say we're talking about dessert after this meal and that's part of their meal plan. And yet I'm not going to tell this other person at the table they don't have the right to state that they're full and that they don't want something. I can't police this person. And I also want to make sure that we're taking responsibility fully where we need to take it fully, and then we're sharing it where it needs to be shared. And that's going to be the same when it comes to someone sharing their personal experience of recovery, someone sharing their personal understanding of, for example, what recovered looks like, sounds like, feels like. I'm not going to police anyone who has gone through recovery to tell them that their experience is wrong or that their definition is not okay. Like, it's their life. That's okay. That's their experience. Do I still expect from professionals to share responsibly? Yes. From other people? Not particularly, because they're sharing their life. Beyond that, it's to everyone that's listening and consuming the content to decide what they're going to do with it.
Yep. I completely agree. That's exactly what I was getting at is what are you going to do with it? Like after you have been triggered, how are you going to handle it? And there's always a level of learning and it's a process, right? Like you said, there's like a postmortem period where you're like, oh, wow, I could have handled that differently. Take those moments and learn from them. And I think that's the best way to go about it. And I think that one final reminder is, at the end of the day, everyone is human and really well-intended people might trigger you because your triggers might be so specific and unique to you that it's impossible to completely control the environment. Like you said, Aunt Claire, we're not living in a bubble. It's hard to be completely trigger-free.
I don't think it's possible because if we wanted to be fully trigger-free, we would have to be fully isolated. That doesn't seem like a good deal. That's literally what an eating disorder does. It isolates us from the world. So how's that like a good deal out of recovery? Now, again, there's like a time and place for things. Place more external boundaries when you are maybe earlier in recovery or in a more difficult space and time in your life phase or whatever, and then open them up and do the postmortems, analyze what's hard, agree with yourself and your team. That's going to help you out. When it comes to how can I pause and redirect my energy and my response, what is that going to mean? Am I going to use healthy self-reminders? I'm going to use mantras. I'm going to reach out to someone. Am I going to use a transitional object to re-anchor in the present moment? Am I going to, I don't know, so many options. And then learn from that and move forward in the world with triggers. And you will get, when it comes to eating disorders specifically, you will get to a moment where even in the presence of triggers, they do not activate you. So by definition, they're not triggers anymore. But this is where you and I are. We don't live in a world that's trigger free, but we live in a world where those triggers aren't triggers for us anymore because we've cut that internal activation. And this is why at the end of the day, the internal boundaries is going to be needed because you will forever move in a world where people aren't going to be fully tailored to you. And so you need to make sure that you know how to have that thing internally where you're like, oh, that's making me feel, and that's still crap. I'm going to deal with that and respond.
Yes, so well said. And I couldn't agree more. But yeah, I think we've covered this topic pretty well. I think we have to, this is a long
This is the thing. Like we could talk about this for another hour, no problem, but we're going to leave it at this. And if you lovely listener, watcher, have an extra question on triggers, leave it in the comments below or send us a little message and we will make sure to come back with a part 2, 3 or whatnot if needed. But we hope that this was a good introduction to the topic.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.